Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about cells and cellular structures and differences between different sorts of cells. And just before we start, I wanted to talk briefly about why we care about cells. So, one thing is that if you remember when we were talking about the characteristics of life, one thing that determined whether something was living or non living was organization. And that usually came in the form of cellular organization or being made up of at least one cell. And then additionally, cells are the smallest unit of life. And actually, a lot of the life that we know of on Earth is actually only one cell. So life doesn't have to be something multicellular like us or animals or plants. A lot of the life that actually dominates Earth is just a single cell. And for these one celled organisms, all of their life processes have to be able to happen within that single cell. And even for multicellular organisms like us, when we're thinking about the processes that support life when they happen, so maybe we could think of things like our heart beating blood around our bodies. A lot of the work that goes into making our heart beat is happening within our heart muscle cells. So there's a lot of complex biochemistry and electrical signaling that's happening inside of those cells to enable our heart to pump. And then lastly, all cells are going to come from pre existing cells. Cells aren't just able to pop into existence. Every single cell is going to come from another cell that already exists. And the process of cell division is going to give rise to each and every cell. So you can sort of trace a cell's lineage back similarly to like how you would do a family tree. Okay, so when we're thinking about cells, one thing that might pop into your head is the fact that cells are really, really tiny. Usually, you can't see them without a microscope. So, why are cells so small? And the reason has to do with the fact that it's more efficient for cells to take in nutrients and export waste when they're smaller. This diagram is showing three cells of three different sizes: a small cell, a medium cell, and a big cell. And when you think about taking in nutrients, there's a barrier between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, and that's the cell membrane. So to get nutrients inside, it needs those nutrients need to cross the cell membrane, and as the cell is going about its business, it's generating waste, and that waste is going to need to get outside the cell. So this exchange is all happening at this barrier here, which is the cell membrane. And when you think about the distance between the innermost part of the cell and the cell membrane, as the cell is getting bigger and bigger, the distance between the center of the cell and the membrane is also getting bigger and bigger. So it's going to take longer and longer for nutrients to come in and for waste to be removed the bigger the cell gets. And one sort of analogy you can think of, let's imagine that you're a waste molecule. So you're something that the cell needs to get rid of. And if we imagine that you're in a really small room, so maybe like a little closet or a tiny bathroom or something, and you need to get out, you can probably get from the middle of the bathroom to the outside of the bathroom really, really quickly, like in a couple seconds, right? Um, and in the same way, if the cell is really small, a waste molecule can get from the innermost part of the cell to the outside of the membrane really quickly. But if you're in the middle of a huge gymnasium or like a big ballroom or something, and you needed to get out, it's going to take much longer. And in the same way, for a really big cell, it would take a really long time from waste in the middle of the cell to get to out. So cells don't become very big because eventually it just becomes impractical and not sustainable them to be doing all of these importing and exporting processes once they get past a certain size. So, the next part of this video, we're just going to be thinking about different kinds of cells. So, like, what's the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell? Or what's the difference between a plant cell and an animal cell? And before we get into all of that, I just wanted to spend a little time and talk about characteristics that every single cell has in common. So, what are the things that every cell has and shares as a common feature? And there are four things, which are a cell membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and DNA. And we'll talk about all of these a little bit more on this slide. So, the first thing is a cell membrane. And I was talking about this when I was talking about the barrier between the outside of the cell and the inside. And that barrier is the cell membrane. And we're going to be talking about this structure actually a lot in a lot more detail later. It'll have a whole video of its own. But for now, let's just suffice it to say that it's the barrier between the inside and the outside. It's very flexible and it's responsible for letting things in that need to get in and letting things out that need to get out. So it's sort of like the first line of defense for a cell in terms of regulating import and export. And then right inside of the cell membrane is what's called the cytoplasm. So this is sort of like a jelly-like or fluid substance that fills up the inside of the cell in the same way that a package you might get could be filled with packing peanuts. So if the packing peanuts were jelly instead, that would be the cytoplasm. And it's sort of just cushioning all of the rest of the stuff that's inside of the cell. So the cytoplasm is this jelly-like fluid and all of the stuff that it's holding. Another important cellular structure is called a ribosome. And ribosomes are important for making proteins. And proteins are involved in virtually everything that a cell does. So proteins are totally vital for everything a cell might be doing, and proteins are made on ribosomes. So you can think of ribosomes as sort of little protein making factories. And then the last thing that every single cell has is DNA. And this is sort of the direction booklet or like a recipe book. It's the master instructions for making those proteins. So all cells need DNA. Okay, so DNA, ribosomes, cytoplasm, and and the cell membrane are the four things that all cells have. And I think I'm actually going to stop this video here. And in the next video about cells, we'll talk about differences between cells and sort of more cellular specialization in the form of organelles. So I'll see you in the next video.